Introducing you.
Ron Simons is a 4-time Tony Award-winning Broadway producer. In fact, he's the only person of color to have ever won so many Tony Awards in Broadway's history. But just a few years ago, he was a corporate technology executive for Microsoft. And now, he's leading an historic effort on Broadway to open more doors of opportunity from those of underrepresented communities.
I did know that there weren't a whole lot of people who looked like me, which was evidence as I got into these rooms, and I was always the only person of color in the room.
I'm Eddie Robinson, and stay tuned for an unguarded chat with actor and acclaimed Broadway producer Ron Simons. He'll tell us about the challenges he's faced in bringing more diverse projects and shows to the Great White Way. How will he change the color of Broadway? And will theater owners commit long-term to those changes? Oh yeah, I feel you. We hear you. I see you. You're listening to I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're so grateful to have with us virtually from his home in New York City, famed actor and Broadway producer, and the most Tony Award-winning Black producer in history. He's also founder and CEO of Simon Says Entertainment, whose mission is to tell the stories of underrepresented communities. He's the renowned Ron Simons. Ron, thank you so much for reserving time out of your busy schedule to be a part of our show, I See You.
Thank you for having me on your show. I'm honored.
So I hear through the grapevine that you're leading some pretty historic, revolutionary efforts to bring in people of color to the Great White Way. Or should I call it the Great Bright Way, as I read a couple of years ago of how famed actress, TV co-host Whoopi Goldberg was looking to find a way to change the nickname for Broadway, right? Mm-hmm. Ron, what's going on? What's your mission? What are you trying to do here? And do you have your stress pills packed? Because this, my friend, sounds like a very interesting task that you're undertaking. I got to tell you, I say all that with a proverbial twinkle in the eye, but I simply applaud your efforts, right? And I bet you're experiencing more drama with trying to paint the Great White Way black than some of the Broadway plays and performance dramas that we've seen on the stage. But tell us more about your efforts, and more importantly, why are you doing this?
I am doing this because of my life experience. And in my life, I have either experienced or seen shocking examples of racism, homophobia, even ageism. And I realized that I could do a couple of different things. I could, I give money and write checks to a number of causes that are to uplift different parts of our subcultures. But At the end of the day, what I do that I feel is helping or hope to help move the needle in all of those areas is storytelling, because I believe storytelling is the greatest agent for change that we have on the planet. So by telling the stories of underrepresented communities, I'm able to hopefully dispel some of the myths and the ignorance that fuels racism, that fuels, all the other isms as well. So it's sort of, I think of it as storytelling is my activism. So wherever I can get the word out, I'm taking that opportunity. So, but yes, I always keep Klonopin in my nightstand, because you ask about, calm me through. I do that. And I have a fully stocked bar. I have a massage therapist on call, okay, as needed. And although I live in the city, I've got some little green space at my apartment, so I love to go out there and become one with nature, even though I'm in this concrete city. So that's the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing.
And if you can reflect for a minute, describe for us, what led you to get involved? Was there an incident or a moment in your career that triggered this initiative to deal with Broadway's race problem?
Well, yeah, but see, the thing is this issue is not confined to just Broadway. This issue I have experienced in every sector that I've ever worked in. I've experienced this in academia. I experienced this in corporate America. I experienced this in not-for-profit sector. So it's nothing new. And I'm always that guy who's on the EDI committee of whatever the institution is, right? I started when I was at Microsoft, I created an organization called BAM, Blacks at Microsoft, which It's still going on to this day, I heard last year.
Microsoft has been committed to change since BAM started over 33 years ago, and we remain committed to driving sustainable progress. From our products
where we bring in kids from at-risk kids from neighborhoods in Seattle to Microsoft and have them meet with a number of professionals. Sometimes it used to be Steve Ballmer and Bill Gates, and understand more about what opportunities are available to them that they might not know from their point of view. So they can learn in opportunities that they could pursue things that they never even considered as something to consider. And that's so much the same thing for Broadway, right? Because a lot of people don't know what producers do. They don't know that they can produce. They don't know, is this a viable opportunity, an option? They know nothing. So that's why I mentor a number of people, right? And my goal is to give them an opportunity to see what's possible, right? Because you can look at me and see the shows that I've done, but that won't tell you the path that it took to get her show to where I am today. And that's really important, right? Because if you really want to be successful in a career, because I tell people, don't be like me and just say, I'm going to produce, and you don't know nobody, you didn't take a class, you didn't read a book, you did nothing. It's like Nike, just do it, right? I don't recommend that. I recommend that you actually either go somewhere to learn the tools of the trade, or you have someone you can learn from, be that a teacher or be that a mentor. So that is my mission, is to make sure that there is opportunity for those who may not realize it, for them to take an active role on Broadway that's not just an actor, right? Because there's general manager, there are press teams, there are, advertising companies, and when I started this company, and for many years, I was the only Black person in the room with all of those. It's like, there was none in the advertising company, none in the marketing company, none in the press, there was none anywhere. So it was always just me. So now I'm seeing more and more efforts to bring particularly people of color into the fold, which will then now basically feed the pipeline. And that's really important for down the road, because people are going to need and want experienced folks, but you can't get the experience until you're doing the thing that you're trying to gain experience in, right? So we're not going to just hire a sound designer who's just arrived on the scene for your Broadway show. You're going to want to have someone who has a proven track record of success and knows what they're doing.
It's ICU. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with Ron Simons. He's the most Tony Award-winning African-American producer of all time. Ron, I'm in love with your risk-taking as you've worked as a former high-tech executive, as you mentioned, over at Microsoft, at the tender young age of 47. What made the switch to you wanting to become a producer? You've talked about mentoring others, but what's your truth, right? I mean, how did all of this come about? Where did you find your passion for producing?
Well, it was by my acting, honestly, because I came out of school and got my MFA in acting at the Professional Actor Training Program at University of Washington. And I came to New York, as graduates do, usually to one of the coasts, New York or LA.
And so you wanted to pursue being an actor.
Absolutely. That's why I went to school. I studied that. That's what my focus was. It never even crossed my mind to produce. I didn't even know what producing did. I didn't care about producing because I'm an artiste and it is my job to tell the stories of blah, 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 blah. Well, you know what? I got to this place where, I had started to see some of the projects that were being greenlit, and I thought they were kind of mediocre, right? And I was seeing shows that were up, and my mindset was, who thought this was a good idea to put on Broadway? So I said, you know what? I'm not seeing the stories that I feel like I want to see, so I'm just going to start producing. And I just literally just decided I'm going to produce, because I thought, well, hell, I know I can do at least mediocre, and I'd like to think that I have enough taste that I know that I could do better than mediocre. And so that's what pushed me in. But, it's all, again, my life and my experiences, dealing with homophobia and racism, that's said to me, the world needs to change. And I see it firsthand. And I was always so shocked when I saw it, in the corporate, in the C-suites, or I saw it, in my job as a consultant, my mind was just blown. I thought we were already past this. We're still dealing with the same sexism, racism. I have so many stories in my arsenal that I could tell that sort of said to me, something's got to change. Something has got to change. And so that's why I said I was going to start telling my own stories through the selection of pieces that I thought were worthy of being told.
And what was your source? What was your motivation to continue? Where did it come from? Because you mentioned you were seeing it a lot in corporate world and in jobs. What was your motivation to move forward?
Well, here's the thing. I felt like when you produce, whether it be a film or whether it be a Broadway show or whatever you're producing, you start off with a vision, right? This is what I want to see happen. This is the kind of story that I think should be told, that I find interesting. And so before I look at anything else, I want to make sure that it is a good story. Because if it's not a good story, all the rest of it doesn't matter. And the other three things that I look for are, it's about underrepresented communities, it has commercial viability, and it's going to have high artistic integrity. So that's the trifecta. So when I find a piece that I think is going to knock it out of the park and provide all three of those, then I'm just drawn to whatever that property is, that story that's being told. So when I started coming closer to producing, I never thought about being a producer. And, you talk about risk. I didn't even think about the riskiness of it. I just thought about, this is something that I would like to do. And I did know that there weren't a whole lot of people who looked like me who did it, which was evidence as I got into these rooms, and I was always the only person of color in the room, right? But at the end of the day, what keeps me going is when I see people who appreciate my story and my story moves them in some kind of way. For example, I did a film. The second film I did was called Gun Hill Road. And it was about a Puerto Rican dad who came home to a philandering Dominican wife and a teenage son who was transgendering.
What do you like, Michael? Football? Basketball? You like school?
Yo, don't forget your panties.
Now, this is 2009. Didn't nobody know nothing about the word transgender? No, I didn't either. I was like, I think I kind of heard it, but I couldn't tell you what it meant, right?
Sure.
So when I read that story, I thought, wow, this story needs to be told. And by the way, I had done my first film before, and I said, oh, that was so hard, I will never do that. I'm glad I did it, mind you, but I'm done washing my hands. I'm going back to acting. Then I met with the writer-director, and I read the story, and I'm like, okay, fine, that has to be told. And you know what I love most about that film is that when we showed it, particularly at film festivals, I loved the grown men, like Latinos particularly, would come up to me in tears, straight, presumably, and say how moving that story was and how it really made them appreciate their relationship with their son. Because at the end of the day, it's not a transgendered story. It's a story about family love, the love between a father and a son. That's what the core of the story is. It's the universal theme, as you will, because all the universal themes have been told. They've just been told through different lenses, and that lens was through a transgendering girl who was working on identifying her authentic self. So when I get that kind of feedback, then I go, okay, this is worth doing. And I thought of one more example where I did a play called Turn Me Loose about 6 years ago in New York, and it was about Dick Gregory, who, as many people know, was an extraordinary comedian. He used to break glass ceilings everywhere he went, and he was also a major civil rights activist.
People always come up and ask me, Mr. Gregory, why are you the way you are? You're so outspoken and sure of yourself. Was you always that way?
We did this play, and we were fortunate enough he came to opening night. It was, big brouhaha. But the thing that I will never forget is he said to us, he said, I thought I was going to die in obscurity, but because of this story that you're telling, I know my legacy will continue on, right? It's hard for me not to get choked up when I hear that, because when I tell you that was a process and a lot of drama, I do not exaggerate in the least. But at that moment, I said, you know what? It was all worth it. It was all worth it. Because when we have a legend, like this man who was personally moved and felt that his story will continue to be told because of some work that we did, I just feel honored.
Coming up, we'll continue our chat with actor Ron Simons, a 4-time Tony Award-winning Broadway producer. We'll ask him whether or not the social awakenings that happened after George Floyd's death in 2020 was enough to keep Broadway diversified, or will efforts from theater owners eventually fade over time? And what about those who are in the industry who say, you know what, let's slow down here, let's be patient. Successful Broadway shows weren't created overnight. How do producers of color on Broadway and Black playwrights react when they hear someone tell them, hurry up and wait? I'm Eddie Robinson. This is ICU, and we'll be right back in just a moment. If you're enjoying this program, please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, ICU with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. You're listening to ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're here with Ron Simons. He's a 5-time Tony Award nominated and 4-time Tony Award winning producer, and a 4-time Sundance Film Festival selected producer. He's leading efforts to diversify Broadway, not only on stage with actors, but also talent crews and leadership positions as well. Your television and film projects include critically acclaimed Sundance films like Gun Hill Road with Esai Morales and Judy Reyes. Also, Night Catches Us with Kerry Washington, Anthony Mackie, and Wendell Pierce. The very intense film Blue Caprice with Isaiah Washington. And of course, your Tony Award-winning shows, which include A Gentleman's Guide to Love and Murder, August Wilson's Jitney, and the Gershwins' Porgy and Bess. Your current projects include For Colored Girls, Thoughts of a Colored Man, Ain't Too Proud, The Life and Times of the Temptations. The projects you've produced, Ron, and they span over several diverse topics and genres. What challenges have you faced bringing more diverse projects to fruition?
Well, I'm thinking back to the very first thing I ever produced, which was my film, The Night Catches Us, as you mentioned. And I remember, this is a film that got into Sundance. It got into Sundance. It was a grand jury nominee already, right, when it got there. And although it was a very difficult process, it happened. So we took, as many films do, we had a sales rep, we had an attorney who went to Sundance with us. And I was expecting that people will just be doing backflips about the film.
Sure.
And one of the first things I got when we were talking through the sales rep was this idea that Black stories don't travel well. Those are the words. Black stories don't travel overseas well. And that is the excuse that's used for not bringing Black content or working to try to even sell Black content outside of the United States. So guess what? It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if you say it's not going to sell and then you don't even try to sell it, then it's not going to sell by definition. Now, I will say this. I did notice that there was this trend, particularly in stories, and I'm going to set all Marvel aside, like, Black Panther. But other than that, the Black stories that seemed to do well in the international market were stories like The Butler, Precious, The Help. It was like these stories that had Black people depicted in the subservient, trauma-driven mindset. People seem to just love that depiction of Black people. And the films that I do, that's not the stories that I tell. I talk about all kinds of different Black people, but one I'm not always interested in telling is the slave story, right? I feel like, not that there isn't room for always more, because, it must not be forgotten. And if you remind people through storytelling, that's great. But for me, I felt that they need to tell other stories because there are so many stories to be told. So many. Everybody has a story. And
That's right.
the more of us who tell our stories, then I think, again, the better chances we are to have people who don't look like us, who don't eat our food, who don't listen to our music, kind of go, you know what? I guess they kind of are. They're pretty much like me. Really, they just are seeking happiness, right? They look for joy. They want to be able to eat and have a roof over their heads, and the American dream.
What do you say to those who come from the School of Arts and say, art has no color line, Ron. If you're hot, you're hot. Not everyone can relate to Black stories on Broadway. What do you say to those people?
Well, that comes across. See, I'm asked that question in many different ways, right? That present comes in different wrapping paper and different bows, that look nothing like one another, right?
There you go.
So I do agree and acknowledge that a good story is a good story. However, I think it's really important for particularly white people in this country and abroad to understand that we as a culture, and in this culture, African American culture, we have been up and spreading the word, the message for years about inequality, about, violence, about, the racism that's happening through the judicial system and the penal system and the educational system and throughout our society. I have had to sometimes explain to people what systemic racism is, and those who I had to argue that, there is such a thing as systemic racism, and I go, absolutely, there is a thing. It's systemic racism. So the point in that was that it's important that we understand that we as Black people can get up as many times a day as we want and sing from the mountaintop. But what needs to change are the white people who are in control of this country, right? So it was a newsflash. I found it interesting, like when George Floyd was killed, and so many white people took to the streets, and I was never seen it before. I was happy and joyous and blah 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 blah. But it was a newsflash, like, they're killing Black men, and I'm like, yeah, and they've been doing that for centuries, killing Black men. So my goal now is to say, hey, the onus can't just be on us. If you really want change, and if you do believe storytelling is an avenue of change, then everyone has to be engaged. Everyone has to pick up that mantle and see that diversity in every corner of our society must be adopted if we want to see a change in the world.
You mentioned a good point with George Floyd and the death in the year 2020. It sent shockwaves right across the globe, with reports, New York Times, Forbes, other reports on how white directors and white actors would still dominate Broadway stages. But, the death of Houston's own George Floyd, that's been happening for years. But thanks to the cell phone, I think discussions of race and inclusion would feel and look a bit different now in 2022 had it not been for the recording of that incident and it being viral. But do you think the social awakenings of 2020 was enough to keep Broadway diversified, or will efforts from theater owners fade over time?
That is the very core question that I ponder and I'm often asked, right? Because I think that you saw what happened this past season in Broadway, that every single new play on Broadway was by an African American playwright. That has never happened on Broadway. And honestly, I don't see that happening ever again on Broadway. But the pendulum swung from like 9 p.m. over to 3 p.m., right? It was like a 180-degree spin, right? So it went from like none to everything it's Black. And I'm not saying I love the season. It was beautiful stories that otherwise had not been for the death of George Floyd, I don't think would have happened, because, right, there was this perfect storm. Yes, George Floyd was killed, but it was also during a pandemic, so people had time to digest news stories in a way that they couldn't if they were working their 9-to-5s, or, because so they had more free time. Lord knows I saw more Netflix than I had seen like in the previous 5 years during that period. Right. So we had time to allow news stories to come in and hit us, and then for us to respond to it. So my hope, my dream is that pendulum that swung from 9 to 3, I wouldn't mind if it was swung from like ongoing from 9 to 5. Maybe 9 to 6:15.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So
Okay.
that it doesn't have to be all black. I don't expect it to be all black, but I would like to see a better representation of stories that fits with the demographics of our country. Because if the diversity that we see in various industries mirrors who we are as an American public, then we will have done something.
And that reminds me of another devil's advocate question of those folks who suggest that, you just need to be more patient, Ron. Broadway didn't become Broadway overnight. After all, it took Hamilton 7 years to come to fruition. How should we interpret those kinds of reactions and responses to saying, time out, it's just going to take some time?
And I say it is true. It is going to take time. We cannot solve this overnight, but we do have to start taking steps like right now to change the system. Because, when I was in corporate America, I would go out and I recruit African Americans to join the company in the various marketing groups around the country. And when I got there, and I said, I'd like to speak to, black marketing people in the company. So I went out there and I met with somebody in documentation. I met with somebody in HR. I met with somebody. And the whole day, not a single marketing person did I meet with. And so they didn't tell me, and I didn't realize until after I joined the company that I was the first African-American, product marketing manager in the history of the company. And I'm like,
my goodness,
really? How is that possible? Right? But it is. And the excuse was the reason they're not represented is because we just can't find them. We just can't find the candidates. And I had to push back and say, well, that means you're not looking because they are there. What effort you are putting or efforts that you're doing to try to diversify are not working because the excuse is not that they're not there. Because I personally know 15 to 20 African Americans that I personally know in marketing who study marketing who would consider an offer to come to Microsoft. So on Broadway, it's about filling the pipeline, right? So I know I can't have, an all black executive admin, or I can't have an account manager for my press team, someone in the marketing team, because they aren't there at all. So we need to bring them in and mentor them. We need to hire them in junior roles so that they can get the experience they need, so that they can one day be the conduit between that company and say a Ron Simons, right? Someone who wants to hire a marketing company and wants to have someone who represents and looks like the culture of the story that we're telling. So the story that we're telling from the advertising campaign is authentic. And so I acknowledge we're not going to be able to change it overnight, but we have to be able to start our efforts today to make that happen for down the line.
That reminds me so much of myself. Coming from New York City, I saw no person of color on air at this station, and yours truly being the first African-American news host for the most listened to program on air, Morning Edition here in Houston, the first. And I was blown away because you're talking about the city of Houston, right? But the kinds of stories, the kinds of pitches that rock your world, Ron, that really captivate you. Tell us more about that. And you mentioned those two words, commercial viability, and that sounds like an investor interest as well. Talk more about that aspect in terms of what you're looking for as far as the kinds of stories and the kinds of pitches that really captivate your world.
Well, people say to me, "Oh, Ron, you have the golden touch. You have the Midas touch." And I'm like, everything you do seems to be successful, either critically, financially, sometimes both. And I just tell people, there's no touch. There is nothing. Midas ain't nothing to do with who I am and what I do. Okay. But what's somewhere in this process, and I actually lay this at the feet of my being an actor and understanding how to read story, how to understand to dissect story, how to understand the quality of story. Because as an actor, that's my job. My job is to interpret what's on that page and deliver it on stage or on film. So not everyone who is a Broadway producer came from the acting world. More of us are happening now, but a lot don't. And so I think that what I have is good taste. I tell people all the time, I may not know everything, but I do know I have good taste. I know good story. when I hear it. And it's hard to say what that means. Like sometimes it's just being able to look at it from a unique point of view. Like I remember someone pitched me this idea of Japanese cowboys in the Midwest. Now, I don't know about you, but I had never heard of no Japanese cowboys in the Midwest. So I was like, really? Tell me more, right? Because I'm like, I had never heard that story. And that's what made that story so compelling. I hadn't read it. I didn't know anything about it other than what they were pitching to me. But at least the thing that I could say about it is that I had not seen that story told before, right? As opposed to, this is a slave narrative about blah, blah, blah. And as soon as you say slave narratives, like I've seen a lot of slave narratives. So it may be different and it's going to be unique and it's going to be to a particular person. But, that area of storytelling has been covered. Sometimes it's just not. And when it's not, then it gets my attention.
Got it. You're listening to ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with Ron Simons. He's the most Tony Award-winning African-American producer of all time, and he's also founder and CEO of Simon Says Entertainment, whose mission is to tell the stories of underrepresented communities. Ron, be honest, how are the numbers looking? Are blacks going to Broadway shows? Are you seeing the numbers you'd like to see come into the theater? Are more people of color coming to Broadway?
That's a very good question. And the answer is sometimes, right? I've been involved where I'm not the lead producer, on shows and this is typical of, Broadway theater goers. They tend to be white women between the ages of 50 and 70, right? Those are the first buyers of tickets for Broadway. And they go see, it's on Broadway, so let's go see it, right?
Right.
But in the interim, the kind of stories that I'm telling have broader appeal. And by that, I mean, not just that core marketing audience that we're trying to reach. For Thoughts of a Colored Man, for example, I took great joy in going down to the lip of the stage and looking up and out, and every night seeing between 75 to 95% of the people in that theater African-American, black and brown faces. That had never happened. If it is, I defy someone to tell me where and what show that was. That had never happened. And you know why? The reason it happened is because not only of what was on stage that those theater goers said, oh, this story may be about me or my family or my cousin or my aunt or whatever, right? Just because it's in the same subculture already said, I'm interested. But the other thing you have to do, you have to be able to reach out to those communities and tell them early on, we want you. This story is about you. Come share this experience with us. If you want to have people come to your party, then you have to invite them. Because if you have a party and no one came because you didn't invite them, well, who's surprised, right? You have to roll out the welcome mat. You have to speak to them where they live. And African Americans you find in different ways than the core theater goer, which is, again, white women between 50 and 70. You can put a whole bunch of ads in the New York Times. You can buy a full double truck, 2 pages, in the New York Times. But a lot of black people won't see that because black people in general do not read the New York Times. Right. But they used to listen to Wendy Williams, they will listen to Steve Harvey, they will go to the radio, right? Yes. So if you really want your story to be told and invite people who don't normally come to the theater, like younger people, like younger African Americans, you got to go where they are. And you got to tell them that you are welcome and please come.
Coming up, more of our chat with multiple Tony Award-winning Broadway producer Ron Simons, and we'll dive deeper into the process of how shows get selected to run on Broadway. Why aren't more productions from black playwrights being seen on the Great White Way? And we want to hear from you. Tell us your thoughts. Do you think theater owners, union leaders, creators, and casting directors are doing all that they can to ensure there's diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility on Broadway? Send us your comments on Instagram or write a comment on our show page, iseeushow.org. I'm Eddie Robinson. Our final segment of ICU happens in just a moment. If you're enjoying this program, please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, ICU with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. We're back, and you're listening to ICU. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson. We've been chatting with four-time Tony Award-winning Broadway producer and actor Ron Simons. He's been on a mission to develop more onstage narratives about underrepresented minority communities, along with mentoring people of color to help them break into creative and leadership positions on Broadway. You know, I was tossing in my brain, if I should share this with you, but it's something about attending musicals and onstage dramatic pieces that to this day, Ron, I get triggered by it. I still have mental issues that I know I'll need to seek therapy for. But as a junior in high school, I played in a musical called Lil Abner. I played the role as Senator Jack S. Fogbound.
Ooh.
And the adult director of the play, from what I vaguely recall, there was a scene in the play where only one of the characters would turn to me and say, "There is no jackass like our jackass." But the woman in charge of the play directed the entire cast, everyone on stage during that scene, to all turn to me with their hands out, pointing directly to me. And they would all say in unison,
Wow.
"There's no jackass like our jackass." And I remember an extremely awkward, deafening silence from the audience, murmurs even, scattered laughter. I looked out after they said that at my mother and father in the audience, and I could barely finish the little song and dance thing that happened after that announcement. And sure enough, it really hurt me mentally. But I felt like I wanted to share that with you and say that students, minority students back in the day, so desperately wanted to play and participate in acting events at their schools, but somehow we were led to believe that we weren't good enough, right? We weren't talented enough. I even remember my aunt. She attended the same public school I did, and she tried out for Annie. And the school, and this was happening in the late 80s, and that same director told her, "Macomb, Mississippi is not ready for a black Annie." And that devastated her. So once again, it just goes to show you that, what you're doing, Ron, is nothing short of amazing. But what do you think Broadway is fearful of, if anything, as it relates to bringing in more diverse programming? What's your take on the matter as you continue to lead these efforts of painting the Great White Way black as we venture into what a 2023 and beyond vision of Broadway would look and feel like?
Well, first of all, it doesn't have to be the Great Black Way, but it should at least be the Great Beige Way, right? That is has some color to it than it does now. So I don't think that in general, other than this past season, fear even factored into the decision making. But I think once George Floyd happened, then fear became part of the equation, because the fear was we can't be seen as part of this system that is withholding access to Black people. So we have got to get on the ball. And it showed me and everyone that you could literally do that overnight. You could literally go out, the theater owners, and pick the plays that you thought are going to make sure that there is a diverse season of shows on Broadway. Mm-hmm. The thing that's really makes this a little challenging is that there are a lot of producers like me who are independent producers, right? So, and we go one at a time to theater owners and we ask for, the theater to open our shows. But there's no one who's stepping back and saying, okay, now let's look at what this season might hold and what does the complexion look like? No one is taking that step to say, oh, wow, it's pretty white. What can we do? And the fact of the matter is that who chooses what the demographic looks like in terms of stories on Broadway are the theater owners. And there are a number of theater owners. Now, the Schuberts have the largest number of theaters on Broadway, right? But they're not the only ones. So one theater deciding, oh, I'm going to be the person who has an African-American story this season or during my season here, is just one off. and I don't know how to solve this problem quite yet, where an entire season, like we as an industry look at what's coming down the pike and we agree, divergent theater owners, divergent producers, saying, how do we make sure that the stories we're telling look like the demographic of our country? How does that happen? Because it's so independent, right? That no one's sort of overseeing it, no one's controlling it, no one's at the helm, right?
Yes.
But what happened this last season is everybody said, I got to get on the bandwagon. And so everybody had black plays, right? And I get it. Makes sense. Because, other industries were issuing press releases and they were like giving millions of dollars to Black Lives Matter, and they were doing, X, Y, Z, ABC.
Right.
Whereas on Broadway, they could literally overnight find 7 black playwrights and produce those playwrights shows. So I think that the problem with Broadway is that Broadway does what Broadway does because it's always done that way. Because you ask people, why is this? Well, that's the way it is on Broadway. As if it shouldn't be any other way. Like, it can't be any other way. So everything has to be the way everything always was. So if that's the case, then of course you should not be surprised that there's no change. Because you're doing everything you always did. And so if you continue to do everything you always did, you're going to get the same result. What is it that saying says? That, the definition of insane is you keep, doing the same thing, but then expect a different outcome.
What's been the most amazing thing that you've loved and enjoyed about being a producer?
I would say, particularly this past season, what gave me immense joy was knowing that because of my 2 plays, Thoughts of a Colored Man and For Colored Girls, which opened in the same season, right? I had 3 shows on Broadway, all about Black people in the same season. Unbelievable.
Wow.
But what I loved about those 2 stories is it gave so many opportunities to so many Black people who had never been on Broadway. Sound designers, costume designers. We had 3 brand new Black producers on Thoughts of a Colored Man that had never produced at all anywhere. It was their first foray, right? That gives me great pride, and that gives me great joy, because the thing is about Broadway, it's like a catch-22. You can get a Broadway gig, but you got to show that you already had a Broadway gig to get the Broadway gig. You know what I mean? And so I'm always joyful when I see, and especially for Colored Girls. I mean, my God, that show, Camille Brown had never even directed on Broadway. And she got a nomination. Not only the first time she did it and got a nomination. The same for our sound designer. Broadway debut and a Tony nomination. That's amazing. And that's what fills me with joy.
You've earned the most Tony Awards as a producer of color in the history of the Tonys. You're also president and CEO of a multiple award-winning production house and consultancy service for artists, producers, and investors. Of all that you've accomplished, Ron, as an actor, as a producer, as a father of 4, what lessons have you learned about yourself thus far?
Ooh, you're going deep, huh? Okay. What lessons have I learned about myself? One thing I know that I need to work on more, and I strive to do so, is I need to become more vulnerable. Because when I became an actor, that was a huge mountain to climb, because working in corporate America and running in hitting racism dead in the face, or disrespect, I developed this skill to have this negative verbiage action hit me, and before I could even feel it, I moved it to the side and said, I'll deal with that later. So someone could say something in the meeting that was racist, and I could say, Ted, that's an interesting point, but actually let's stay on mission. What we're trying to figure out is ... So what that did was that alienated me from my emotions, which of course is death for an actor, because you've got to be in touch with your emotions, because it's a dialogue. A character gives you gives to the character, the other actors on stage. So having an openness is really key. So I've gotten better at acting. Now I'm working on putting that into my everyday life to be more vulnerable, because that's something that I know needs to happen. I know that I am also relatively risk averse, and by that I mean clearly I take chances, right? But I feel as though
Clearly.
I don't want to take chances in hurting people in any kind of way, right? Even financially. So when I talk to people about, investing on Broadway,
Sure.
much to the chagrin of my, partners, I will begin the conversation with number one, this is a very risky investment. I want to make sure that you understand that very upfront. And also, I think I realize that I have some work to do in the face of power. Um, Power as exuded by white people, because my process, and has been the way I got through life, is to listen, hear it, experience it, then take time to digest it, then come back and respond to it. Right. But what that looks like in the room is Ron's not saying anything. He just let that happen. Do you know what I mean? Because I'm not that person. I have a friend named George. Someone will do something, and I mean instantaneously. He has that witty response, that's gonna cut somebody or put them in their place or make sure they know what's going. He just has that skill. I'm in my head a little too much for my own good. So I need to understand, because sometimes I just can't even believe what I'm hearing. Like, I remember I was dating someone, white attorney general, New Jersey. We're driving in his car, and he was telling me about his job, and I was like, you know what? I'd like to go to your office and see
Okay.
what all this is about. I'd like to go see, what does a wiretap room look like, and blah, blah. So I was saying that, and he said to me, well,
Oh.
I'll let you know when we have Bring Your Mandingo to Lunch Day. And I turned my head to look out the window because I know that's not what he said. So I
Got it.
Bring Your a Nina, what could he
Right.
possibly have said other than Bring Your Mandingo to Lunch Day? And
Yeah.
so I ran out of options. That's what the man said. So I turned with him, and this is how,
Wow.
this is I'm sure there's a word for this, and a passive aggressive, I don't know what it is. But the first thing out of his mouth was, oh, come on, Ron, I'm just kidding. Come on, we can joke
Sure.
like that. Come on. Don't be such a stick in the mud. Like, it's my problem. It's my fault, because I was taking it too literally, when in fact I should take it in some other kind of way.
Wow.
Right? So
Sure.
sometimes I just get
Sure.
caught off guard. Like, I couldn't really respond in that moment because I was so shocked
Yes.
that actually happened, that I could not believe that it actually.
Yeah.
So I'm
And he
so
said
grateful.
that.
I'd like to be more in the moment, to give what I want to say in that moment and be articulate enough to say it. But
Okay.
I don't know. For some reason, my brain just doesn't work that quickly. But I do come back. I do say it. I mean, at Microsoft. I'm bored with all these little details. But I was standing in a doorway talking to a colleague of mine, and a friend of mine came down, white, who was coming down the hallway, and we had just moved around offices. And so he said, "Hey, Ron, how's it going?" I said, "Hey, how you doing?" He said, "Oh, your office must be down here somewhere. I smell watermelon." And then he kept on walking down the hall, and I thought, again, no, he didn't say that. Did he say? And then I looked at the woman I was talking to. Her jaw was on the floor, and I said, wow,
Right.
he really said that. Every time I saw that man, I could
Sure.
not open my mouth because I could feel the rage come up in me, So I had to wait 12 weeks until we were out of town at Las Vegas at this big electronic convention to say, hey, can we grab a cup of coffee? And we went, and I told him, I don't even know if you remember saying this. I said, but you said such and such to me, and I was highly offended that you would say that to me when I thought you were my friend. And of course, oh, Ron, I'm so sorry. I know I didn't mean it that way, and blah, 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 blah. But again, that's the case of Ron needs a minute to kind of digest, and then he'll come back with what is an articulate comment or rebuttal. I didn't understand the importance of grace, and by grace I mean forgiveness, until I got a phone call, and a gentleman asked me, "Is this Ron Simons from St. Ladislaus in Hamtramck?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I don't know if you remember me, but my name is Mark Heinrich." And the moment he said that, I was thrown back to the 7th grade, when blindly he came up and hit me in the dead of my back with his fist at all of his might. And I literally fell to the concrete in pain. And then I turned around and I saw who it was. I stood up and I saw red. And then after a while, I came back to consciousness and people were pulling me off of it. But that had such a major impact on me. He said to me, Ron, I did some awful things to you while we were in school. He says, I want to deeply apologize to you. I want to apologize to your family for any pain that I might have caused them. And I hope that maybe you might find it in your heart to forgive me. And when he said that, I paused. And I remember thinking, hell no, I'm not forgiving you. You know what you caused me? I mean, blah, blah, you have pain and anger and confusion. And I didn't understand what, blah, blah, blah. But there was this little voice in the back of my mind that says, forgive him. And I was like, no. I said, forgive him. And so I opened my mouth and I said, I forgive you. The moment those words left my mouth, this weight came off of my shoulders. And immediately I did not carry any more anger, hurt, grief, despair, confusion. It was all gone. So I could hear Mark Heinrich's name anytime, anywhere, and I won't be triggered because I let it go. And so that showed me it's important that you show grace to others and that you show grace to yourself, that you forgive yourself for things that you do. That's my greatest lesson to learn to date.
I really, really appreciate you being on our show. This has been enormously refreshing for me to hear your stories and your narratives. And I, again, applaud your efforts of what you're doing is just truly fantastic. 4-time Tony Award winning producer. You've earned the most Tony Awards as any producer of color in the history of the Tonys. It's fantastic. President and CEO of Simon Says Entertainment. Thank you so much, Ron Simons, for being a guest on ICU.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your stories too.
Our team includes technical director Todd Holzlander, producer Laura Walker, editors Mark DeClaudio and John Mitchell Good. ICU is a production of Houston Public Media. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen and download your favorite shows. I'm your host and executive producer, Eddie Robinson. And I feel you. We hear you. I see you. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.